All right. Hi, Matt.
Hey Graham, good to see you.
Good to see you. How are you this evening?
See you well, thanks. How about you?
I'm all right. How are you really, though? Because tonight we're going to be examining radical honesty and radical transparency. So maybe have another go. How are you?
It's good. That's clever what you did there. Yeah, a little tired, but I genuinely am pretty good.
So I think tonight we want to have a proper exploration of radical transparency and radical honesty. And maybe we can explore to begin with if there's any difference between those two terms. Because increasingly I've seen that term and that idea brought into the conversation about good relationships, and the idea that radical honesty in relationships is really, really beneficial, drives greater trust, drives greater intimacy in relationships. I think it had its origins in business, that kind of idea of radical transparency, of being very, very open, that a lot of people have then brought into the world of relationships. But what's your initial response when you hear that term, kind of radical honesty or radical transparency? What do you feel about it?
I feel a couple of things. I think it sort of instinctively makes me a bit nervous when I hear it around relationships, when I hear clients talking in those terms. And it often means knowing one another's PIN number to the phone or whatever, knowing like that kind of stuff, which I'm not sure is such a good idea. I hear a bit about it in parenting. My boys are getting to the age where they might or might not get mobile phones soon, and parents tell me about contracts that you kind of agree with your kids, and that they basically consist of you being able to see every aspect of their communication and life, which I'm not down with. I just don't think that's a good idea. I think they're entitled to some privacy. So I think first that's my first instinct when I think about it.
Is a kind of nervousness around it potentially forcing out privacy?
Yeah, that we are private and separate, aren't we? And that we want
Yeah.
some stuff which I think is private and separate because we just do. And I think in the end, like maybe we'll explore this a bit more, but I think it's good for a relationship as well that you're doing things which are individual, which are unique to you, and which you then can share at a time of your choosing in the manner of your choosing with your partner, rather than they've seen it all in advance. They know exactly where you are. Those kind of things that to me, I don't value that. I don't want that in my own relationship, and I see it go wrong in the relationships of some of the couples that I work with and try and help. What about you though?
Well, I come at it from trying to understand what is genuinely helpful and, to use the terminology, radical about it. I struggle, and maybe we can tease this out with some examples. I struggle to really understand what is genuinely radical about this concept. So I think honesty in relationships is crucial to driving trust and intimacy. Where that becomes radical honesty, I think, is a fine line between being a bit of a, frankly, being a bit of an arse at time from time to time, being a bit too thoughtless with our comments. But when I hear other people talk about it, it sounds like there's some values around compassion and thoughtfulness in the radical nature of radical honesty that, again, maybe we can kind of explore and see if it's more helpful than instinctively I think the concept is.
Yeah, I think I agree with what you're saying there. If I'm following along, so I just reread really quickly Sam Harris's
Yeah.
book.
Yeah, I was going to bring him up. Yeah.
And I think that I enjoyed it, like however many years ago I first read it. I think he's really onto something. He basically says, don't lie, you can always be truthful. And there's a guy called Brad Blanton who's been profiled by This American Life, ran for Congress, I think, a while back. He also happens to be a psychotherapist, and he's got the same kind of notion that all of the sort of silly things we say, the way we soften things, the way we back off things, don't help us grow up, don't help us mature, don't help our relationships, don't help public life, don't help politics. So that was his sort of that's his kind of that's his shtick, and I admire that in terms of what he's tried to do, what he's saying, and I think that basic stance that Sam Harris takes on lying is a good one. It's writ through other traditions as well. It's a massive part
Mhm.
of sobriety and recovery via 12 step. That's like absolutely at the heart of it. If you're not being honest with yourself, you're not being honest with others, you're in all sorts of trouble.
There are a couple of examples in the Sam Harris book that I really like. One is around when he sends drafts of his most recent books to his mates, to his friends, and he asks for their feedback. And there's the usual group who will just butter him up a little bit and say, Sam, it's amazing. This is your best book yet. And then he's got a small cohort of people that he genuinely trusts and genuinely holds as his true friends who say, actually, this needs a bit of work. I like this bit of it, but this isn't as good as you can do. And the feedback from those people is the feedback that he genuinely values the most. So there's something there about trust in friendship that I think is grounded in a quite radical and quite brave honesty. And then there's the example of the classic kind of does my wife look good in this dress when she asks me, and a way to honestly answer those kind of questions and to feel like you're not telling a white lie, but to engage honestly with your wife, with your partner in those kind of situations in a way that isn't just saying, well, no, you don't look good in it,
Yeah.
which is the kind of more thoughtless image of radical honesty that comes to my mind when people use the term.
Yeah, I agree. I quite like that example he had in there about the dress, and he says something like, if actually the subtext is, do you still find me attractive? Do you think I look good in this? Then you can answer it that way, you know. But if it is an actual question about an actual dress, you could say, do you know what? I don't think that this color really suits you, or the cut of that I don't think brings out, you know. And then you can describe the attributes and the things that you like most, and there's a more constructive, kind of interesting, useful conversation to be had there. But I think if the subtext really is, tell me I look good because I want to hear it from you, then you can answer it that way too. It's not an invitation to be,
Yeah.
I don't remember what that saying is, but there's something about you know, people who are interested in brutal honesty are sometimes more interested in the being brutal than the being honest.
Exactly. That's what I worry about a little bit with it. I guess I also worry about the link with self-actualization, the idea that my truth is important to communicate at all times, and it's important for my friends and my partner to hear my experience and hear my views and hear my lived experience, to use the terminology of the day, that I think often is valid, but often tips into, well, actually, I'm not sure everything about your experience needs to be vocalized or is of interest to another person.
Where we came in on this was you sending me the clip of, remind me what the film is.
Oh, it's Old School with Will Ferrell.
It's Old School with Will Ferrell. Thank you. And he,
Can't believe you forgot that.
in that clip, he is talking with his wife to a therapist who encourages him to be honest and open, and his wife says the same. And then he starts to share, and he talks about fantasizing about a waitress in a restaurant, which is, yeah, it's done in that kind of Will Ferrell way, so you'd have to kind of see it to really get the joy from it. But it's quickly becomes evident that that is not what he's meant to be saying, and she is not amused, and he's completely missed the cue. And I just wondered whether that was on your mind as well when you were talking about radical honesty. There's a kind of part of us that feels a bit more private. There's a part of us that wonders whether we've chosen the right person. There's a part of us that wonders whether we might have been happy with somebody else. Somebody at work catches our eye. Does all of that need to be talked about and disclosed? And what do you make of that?
Well, I think that's where you get into the radical bit of radical honesty. So what we talked about a moment ago with Sam Harris, and the example in the Sam Harris books is the virtue of honesty and the importance of honesty. If you then attach the word radical, then it's got to mean something more than just basic honesty, right? And I think the radical bit of it is sharing more of your inner thoughts and desires and opinions than is more commonly assumed you would in a relationship. It's being quite proactive, I think, about some of those thoughts and even desires, like in the kind of Will Ferrell scene. So yeah, I was thinking about kind of radical honesty and how he just completely misinterprets what is designed as a kind of safe space for him to explore his relationship with his wife, and he goes into radical honesty without really understanding the context he's talking about. But I think there are proponents of that kind of conversation in relationships. You see it, and I've listened to a few podcasts in advance of this one. You listen to podcasts where they will advocate for total honesty about sexual desires and fantasies and previous relationships and what was good about them and maybe even better about them than the relationship you're in. And I'd be interested in exploring like what we think about the benefits of that in our work with couples.
Yeah, I was going to say, because you and I see couples in our work, and we also see individuals as well. So we, because of the nature of the work we do, you get to hear very personal, intimate things that individuals are thinking and experiencing. They share with you, you know, an incredible amount of things that they typically wouldn't share, sometimes with anybody else in the world. So when I'm with a couple, I'm often thinking, if I was with this person on their own, they would be talking in quite a different way, you know? So I've got in mind that there are things that they're probably thinking that would be really difficult for the other person to hear. But I think those things are really ordinary, because I think some of them, and lots of the people I see think them. And the other book I was just going to mention was Sex and the Psyche, the book by Brett Kahr, who's an old colleague of ours from Bowlby Centre days. And what I liked about that book, it's basically a description of the sort of sexual fantasy life of people in the UK. So it's quite a big sample size, I think around 20,000 people. So I mean, not huge, but pretty big. And it's
Classically repressed British nationals.
yeah, and it's a description of really vivid, sometimes filthy and shocking sexual fantasies. And whether or not that would be a good idea to be sharing with friends, family, and, you know, lovers, I'm not so sure about.
Well, sure, but I imagine you can visualize a situation where it would be potentially helpful, driving intimacy, driving trust in a relationship. No.
For sure, yeah, I can absolutely see that. But you know, as you go through the fantasies in that book, and what I thought was good about that book was that he does give some space. He doesn't just talk about people having sexual fantasies. He gives the people who are having the fantasies, he puts them in their words. Some of them are very short and the kinds of things that you might expect, you know, sex with a coworker. Some of them are wild, you know, just really, really unusual, lots and lots of detail. And those kind of things, I think, would be almost impossible to talk about in a relationship, I think.
Or possible, but only in a small cohort of relationships with very specific personalities in them. I guess there's something so crucial about the personalities of the two people involved in the relationship, right? So I think you kind of instinctively know in a relationship whether you're in a relationship with someone who values privacy, who wants to talk about those kind of areas of their private life, or whether they don't. And I think they'd find it quite, some people would find it really quite intrusive and quite upsetting to have some of those things said in the bedroom.
Yeah, I was just looking at some of the numbers. So people who've had fantasies about sex with somebody else's partner, sex with a friend's partner, for example, 23% of people responding had had that kind of fantasy. And I think that one, you know, I think that's it's hard to share.
Yeah, well, I think some of those fantasies that become uh, potentially so connected to the real world, I think, are possibly the hardest to share and the hardest to hear, right? If it's pure fantasy, will never happen, probably feels less intimidating to both say and to hear.
Yeah, and I guess fantasies, they sort of sound quite jolly and fun and harmless. Maybe that's the kind of vibe we're giving off. But some of them are really dark. You know,
Right.
lots of them are around aggression, and
Yeah.
not just tying somebody up in play and being dominant in a role play situation, which immediately reverses when you come out of that with all the kind of safe protocols and whatever around it, but like really quite dark fantasies. And like, you know, 3% of the people surveyed had fantasies about having sex involving an animal, and
Yeah.
that we don't really account for that. That's a lot of people.
Yeah.
You extrapolate that and you say that that probably applies across a bigger population. That gets you into 1 million plus people.
And what would you say to the idea that sharing that with a partner, not in the interest of kind of playing it out in the real world, but sharing it in the interest of them understanding you, understanding the full you, the idea of your whole self, bring your whole self to work, bring your whole self to a relationship. So you should share everything with your partner. Why wouldn't that drive intimacy and connection?
Yeah, I think it's a great challenge, and I don't think I have a particularly brilliant answer. My objection to the bringing your whole self to work was that it would make more sense to bring your best self to work, and I think it makes
Yeah.
more sense to bring your best self to the relationship. So I'm often a bit sleep deprived and grumpy. Who cares? Who wants to hear that? So when my wife asks me how I slept, I try and not either answer that question, or I say, yeah, fine, not too bad.
Yeah.
If it really was like a interrupted night and I do feel really jaded and it might impact the day, I might mention it, because it might be useful to do so.
Why then with me do you bore on about your sleep all the time?
but I think there's something about exposing all of that, talking about
Yeah.
all, which just doesn't. I don't think it really. I don't think it really helps.
What do you make of that connection with self-actualization, though? The idea that, our everything about us is important, and therefore, of course, everything about us should be important to the other person. I think so much of our inner experience is frankly mundane and boring
Right,
and has no need to be shared.
we're full of shit, aren't we? I mean, the thoughts that I have are ridiculous and pointless, and my petty preferences and desires for the world to be a certain way are mostly ridiculous, that need to be like caught and recalibrated or reset,
We're being quite down on this idea of radical honesty. Let's take a step backwards, maybe, because a lot of people that advocate it for really quite benevolent reasons. They want to help couples who might be avoiding some pretty important things in their relationship. I think most of us, maybe you could challenge that, most of us are a little bit risk averse. We're a little bit conflict avoidant. We're a little bit averse to saying that difficult thing that possibly needs to be said, even if it's, that small thing you did annoyed me a little bit or upset me. It's easier to just sweep it under the carpet. It's the idea of opening those kind of conversations up in a relationship genuinely has value.
It's an interesting challenge, that, isn't it? Because as you were saying that, I was thinking, I guess what I'm often encouraging couples to do is say what they want. I'm not thinking necessarily in the bedroom now, but just more generally, what they want in terms of the division of labor, or where they want to send the kids to school, or where they want a holiday, or how much time they want to spend with one another's families. Not to say what you want, because that's what you'll get and that will close the conversation down, but it's worth knowing, isn't it? Where do you want to live? Like, what do plans for retirement look like? Where do you think you'll buy your first home? What are your career aspirations at this point in your life? Saying all of that, getting that out there, getting that heard, making the case for it is useful. Yeah, I mean, I was just sort of struck by your challenge on that one, I guess.
Yeah, maybe we're just back in the kind of difference between honesty and radical honesty. So I think in most situations, we're talking about be a bit more honest with yourself about how you're feeling in the relationship, about what you need, about what you want, about what might be going wrong for you in the relationship, and take a bit more risk with talking about that in a calm, compassionate, thoughtful way. I think that's quite different to the image that's often presented about radical honesty, which is no, it's healthy and positive for your relationship to share pretty much everything about what you're feeling and what you're thinking, even if that does have compassion and thoughtfulness in it. And maybe we can tease this out, because one of the principles that's often cited is that if you're going to bring radical honesty to the table, you need to do it in a compassionate, thoughtful way, which is lovely in theory. But I think we can easily all tell ourselves a story that we're being thoughtful when we say that someone's new haircut doesn't look good. If the draft of their new book is not up to their usual standards, we can all tell ourselves a story that that's good for the other person, even when frankly we're being a bit of an arse.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, no, I agree. I think I was reading something else about couples, and I can't remember the name of the book now. It doesn't matter very much, but the guy who was talking in the book was talking about the value of separate bedrooms, if you could make that work,
Oh, yeah.
separate separate sleeping arrangements and separate kind of toileting and ablution. So we don't see all of that, right? So there's a bit of mystery that we don't necessarily always wander around naked, that there is something held back, you know, that those things still feel alluring rather than really commonplace. I was talking with a couple a long while back now, and he was finishing her sentences about some bowel trouble that she'd had because he was really involved in it, you know, really had the detail on it. And she wasn't annoyed with him because he was like, you know, finishing the end of her sentences. They were in this thing together. And I mean, it wasn't a very serious issue. It wasn't a life-changing diagnosis or anything like that, but he knew all about it. And I just wondered, the problem we were talking about was sexlessness in their marriage. I wondered how much that was helping, you know, drive desire for her, you know, in that situation. I don't know whether I would want all of that
I
on
think
the.
I think you're being a bit diplomatic there, aren't you, with how you're describing it? I think you'd be a bit firmer with them, wouldn't you? Knowing you in the room with them, you'd be saying, this seems to me like a pretty good example of where you might be going wrong, and I'd advise you to have a rethink, wouldn't you?
Yeah, it feels a bit enmeshed, doesn't it, to
Yeah.
be involved in one another's kind of you know, medical bodily bits and pieces. No, I'm not saying that. You know, also see couples who are very private about those things. So there's another couple that come to mind where he had quite a serious health issue, which he didn't tell anybody in the family about, including his wife, until he was going into hospital, and then he announced it. And
Bloody hell.
you know, we've gone, I guess, from one extreme to another, haven't we? I think when it's there's a bit of judging all of these things on their merits, isn't there? Is there a moment to be I don't know what radical honesty means, really. Is there a moment to be honest about these things? Yeah, sure, right. And is there a time and a place? I
Well,
wouldn't advise that client to unveil that on his son's 20th birthday, or, you know, whatever else. But there is a moment where you're like, look, I want you to get this kind of, you know, right sized, really routine procedure, fantastic odds of recovery, but I am having to go through this process. You know, that would be for me, you know, an effective way of sharing it. But I don't know, temporary trouble with bowel movements. I might not.
right. So I was trying to think of some examples where radical honesty might help or hinder you, right? How does that act as a guide
Yep.
in any real life situations? Because honesty is a great virtue, but like all virtues, taken to an extreme is frankly a little bit ludicrous. So the idea of radical honesty, I was just trying to locate in specific examples. So one I was thinking of is, you find out that a good friend of yours, their partner is cheating on, right? So you have a choice. Do you tell your friend that you know that their partner's cheating on them, or do you hold back because it's not your place to do that, right?
Yeah.
I'm not sure that radical honesty offers anything to really help guide that decision. Because if you apply the principle of kind of thoughtfulness and compassion to your friend, how does that help you? You know that your friend might be devastated by this information. It might destroy their family. It might turn their life upside down. So that leads you down the not telling them the answer to the question. The radical honesty of, well, you should just say everything, just guides you to say that their partner's having an affair. But if you apply the principles that underpin it, that doesn't help you either. So you just get lost in a circular process that doesn't get you any further forward in the kind of dilemmas that really come up in life anyway.
Yeah, I guess it's just too categorical for us, right? I think that's what we're saying, aren't we? That you would probably have to think that issue through on its merits, and
Exactly.
it would be a balanced judgment, and you might come to a defensible decision, which might not be the right decision, but you would have thought it through. But I guess anything that starts up front with the answer feels to me almost inherently wrong. In the work that I do, I'm telling one person, I'm asking them, inviting them, sometimes encouraging them and telling them to do something, which in another example with another person, I would be advising the exact opposite, or having that person wonder about the exact opposite, or trying to get them curious about doing it in a completely different way. Because for the people who are, I don't know, aggressive and assertive and falling out with everybody, they might need to turn it down. For the people who can never speak up at work and never point out that they've been overlooked for promotion, or being selected for a prize piece of project work, they need to speak up. So it feels a bit like radical honesty is the answer to everything.
Well, interesting you use those examples, because a lot of the podcasts I listen to and things that I've seen written about radical honesty tend to be written or talked about by women, and there might be a kind of link to assertiveness and boundaries for women, where there's a kind of helpful strand of radical honesty there in terms of encouraging greater assertiveness and healthy boundaries.
Yes, yeah. Speaking up, Esther Perel says some stuff around that. She, in terms of affairs, I think she writes really well on that, and she says like the detail of the affair. The whether he bought her a silk scarf and where they first had sex and what positions they had it in, and all of that. Probably in the end doesn't do you a great deal of good in some models of kind of recovery from the affair. There's a thing called full disclosure, which is similar to what we're talking about. To ask anything, and the other person will submit to that, and it wouldn't be how I would approach it. I wouldn't want to work on that basis. I think it's entirely unhelpful.
Good.
Might depend on the couple. If they were both up for it and they, that was somehow making sense to them, and I thought they could deal with it, and it was the only possible way through, I might flex on that, but I definitely wouldn't start there. In addiction recovery in 12-step, it's sort of, you save your own skin, by blurting it all out, and you hurt and damage somebody else. So there's something about just acknowledging what you've done. I think the phrase in Alcoholics Anonymous is something like, we acknowledge we've been wild in a general way, but we're not getting into the detail of it, because that's not helping. It's not helping the other person. And that, I suppose, is where we might try and put the focus.
Or at the very least, you don't know if it's going to help the other person.
And I think you could take a reasonably good guess that it's not going to. That kind of the notion of radical honesty for me, if I was going to say what was in my mind in this situation, what would that help the other person? Perhaps not. Don't do it. Would that help? Don't think so. Hold it. Wait, pause, think again.
Good. Okay. Anything more to add before we wrap up? Because no, I'm radically honest, I've probably heard enough about enough of your voice this evening already.
Yeah, and certainly enough about bowel movements, huh?
Yeah. Good. All right, let's leave it there. See you soon.
Okay.